Hi, I'm Stephen Reily, Director of the Speed Museum, and I'm delighted to join you tonight for a Director's Cut conversation with Brother Paul Quenon from the Abbey of Gethsemani. Today is the day we open the Shaker Commonwealth, two paired exhibits that celebrate the history of the Shakers in Kentucky. One called Careful, Neat, and Decent celebrates a whole philosophy of design, including furniture, seat packets, silk fabric, and more, organized by our curator, Scott Urbis. And the second, called When the Spirits Moved Them, They Moved, presents a video installation celebrating a deep sense of place at Pleasant Hill and produced by Mariam Ghani, the filmmaker, with choreographer Aaron Ellen Kelly in partnership with the Louisville Ballet. But tonight I get a really happy opportunity to have a conversation I'm calling Shakers, Monks, and Merton with Brother Paul Quenon from Gethsemani. Brother Paul joined Gethsemani when he wasn't yet 18 in 1958. He is one of the few people left. He got to learn do his novice training under Thomas Merton, called Father Lewis in Gethsemani's nomenclature. And he knew Merton, Father Lewis, for the last 10 years of his life, the first 10 years of Brother Paul's period in the monastery. Brother Paul is a celebrated poet, photographer, and memoirist, most recently with a book called In Praise of the Useless Life. And I'm really excited to talk to him tonight about parallels between Shakers, monks, and even today, a year that's become more monastic for him and for many of us in the world. Welcome, Brother Paul.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So let's talk about, you and I had a pre-conversation. It's so interesting how the Shakers and monks have similar legacies or similar approaches to life, how the Rule of Benedict, which gave birth to the Cistercian movement, and the Trappists, of which you are continue to be part of, what, a 500-year, no longer, 800-year legacy. The Shakers were created much later, around in the 18th century, but many things in common, particularly for a Protestant Christian sect. What similarities do you see? And also, I should point out the really interesting fact that the Shakers and the Trappists came to central Kentucky in exactly the same year, 1806.
Oh, really?
And they settled just 50 miles from each other in this very rich agricultural land of central Kentucky.
Yes.
You all, the Trappists in between New Haven and Loretto, and the Shakers at Pleasant Hill.
That's right. Well, the first thing that strikes me is the fact that there is this Protestant community which practices celibacy. Now, this is sort of out of the ordinary because the reformers had rejected celibacy as a way of life, as being non-scriptural. And of course, it's elemental to monasticism. So you would say that perhaps that could only have been founded by a founder who was a woman, who was familiar with the suffering and great difficulty of what it is to be a housewife and raising children and so forth. That is quite extraordinary to start with. And then the other feature where it differs from our monastic practice is that there was both men and women in the community. Now there are rare occasions in the Middle Ages where there are both men and women living in separate quarters. That would be continuing today in some smaller communities. There's a Community of Jesus in Brewster, Massachusetts, the Episcopalian monastic community. They follow the rule of St. Benedict and sing their office in Latin, of all things. But so that's one great connector with the other is that the authority system. Now we have there was Mother Ann. She was called Mother Ann, and we have the abbot, who's the father. Mother Ann was a representative of the Holy Spirit, as I understand, or maybe of Christ. The abbot is considered by the rule of St. Benedict to be representing Christ in the community. But for all that, there hasn't been a cult of the abbot, in the sense that we sing hymns to our abbot. You'll find such things in the Shaker hymnology. So that is one connector.
What about, we talked about orphans as well, that both traditions, both the Shakers and the Trappists have had a traditions of taking orphans in as well.
Well, that is found in the rule of Saint Benedict, not necessarily orphans, but oblates, they were called, where two parents may want to offer their child to the monastery. And there was a ceremony in which his hand was wrapped in the altar cloth and he was taken in and raised by the monks. Now that did not become part of the Cistercian tradition, but after the French Revolution, it became more important for monks to prove their social utility. And so having orphans and so forth was something, a practice that was accepted. So when the first attempt of establishing a monastery in the United States back in the 1790s, they brought 40 orphans with them on ship across the ocean. Once they hit the harbor, many of them split. They got a free trip across the ocean, but they did continue and travel with the monks. It must have been very difficult.
Our curator tells a great story. So the Shakers, I think, took in orphans because of their goodwill, but also, as you mentioned, may have been similar for the Trappists as a recruiting tactic for a non-perpetuating kind of group. There's a story that the Shakers at South Union took in 18 orphans from all the way as far as New Orleans. And it was actually it was controversial. The New Orleanians weren't sure they wanted to let them go, whether they were going to be put into forced labor. And Henry Clay actually wrote a letter to the citizens of New Orleans attesting to the good character of the Shakers of South Union. But the orphans there, most of them did not stay. They were either tempted into backsliding or they ran off with women they had met somewhere else. But I do think it's a similar tradition. Are there orphans are there people who've come to Gethsemani now who came as orphans?
Oh, well, they came as adults.
Yes.
Might have been, orphaned when they were children, but it's certainly not the practice now. It did continue. After when we were founded in 1848, there was a boys' school connected to the monastery, and there again, it was partly because of the need of the area, and partly because it was a way of, making ourselves socially acceptable to the people in the country. And that lasted up until, I think, 1933 or sometime in the 1930s. The school burned down, and it was never reestablished because by then there was public education. It was quite available. I can imagine if there were, oblates, we might call them, if they were still a part of the community, it would certainly change the tone of life in a monastery where you have these kids running around. And of course they, in the 1800s, they had to practice silence like the other monks. Charles Dickens made a visit to our monastery in Iowa, and he was horrified at the fact that there were these young people and they were not allowed to talk. He gave a very negative review of the Trappists in the United States.
Well, the Trappists had that in common with the Shakers, because Dickens also visited a Shaker community, and in his very Dickensian way, I don't have it in front of me, he kept saying it was very grim, full of grim people and grim sayings, wearing grim clothes, which of course we look at it and it's not true at all. Let's also talk about architecture and design. I mean, our exhibit, Scott Urbis's exhibit at the Curator, celebrates the Shakers really approach all of life with the sense of design. And you talk about the Cistercians really having originated with that kind of spirit as well.
Well, the Cistercian architecture originated in the Romanesque period, and that was just on the cusp of the shift to Gothic style. The characteristic of our architecture is that it's unadorned, very simple. And that corresponds to what was the ideal of the order. That is, a church in which there is no adornment, no stained glass windows, no icons except for one of Our Lady and the child Jesus. And at the altar was a crucifix, which was to be painted, with the corpus of Jesus on the, and it was wooden. So that was very minimalistic. Even today, if you walk into a Cistercian church, you might think it's very Protestant.
Yeah, or very shaken.
Yeah, and when we did our renovation here at Gethsemani back in the 1960s, we had an eye to this shaker architecture. Brother Clement, who was the cellarer at the time, went to visit the designer, William Schickel, and the first question he asked says, "Do you like shaker art?" And he said, "Yes." And at that point, he was in.
He was hired.
Yeah, pretty much. So the thing about Cistercian architecture is that it has a gracefulness about it, an integrity, just like the Shakers, an authenticity. I would say that was the most characteristic mark, both with the Cistercians and the Shakers, is the sense of authenticity. There's nothing that is superfluous. And we have stained glass windows with color glass in it, but no designs.
So the Shakers would found you very, very indulgent, maybe, for that little decoration. Let's talk about work too, because another similarity is what I might call work is really grounded in the theology of the Shakers as well as in the rule of Benedict.
Well, yeah, work is one of the necessary, the three elements of our life. Ora et labora, work, prayer and work, and then added to that would be lectio, that is reading. So those are the three principal practices. The work was primarily, of course, the work of God, which takes place in the church, and where we have psalmody. But work in the fields. Now, the monks did sometimes employ helpers to work in the fields, but if there's not enough help, then the rule of Saint Benedict says the monks have to work for themselves. They're all the better monks. Now, that was practiced more or less by the Benedictines, but when the Cistercians came along in the 11th, 12th century, they made a point of using manual labor as a required element in our life. So it was an agricultural order. They developed the land. They developed swamp area. That was land reclaiming. And also they kind of had a corner on the sheep market, especially in England. So it was very successful, and that might have been the downfall of the order. We became too successful.
It became attractive to others, right? And we're together. Well, the Shakers, at their peak, and as you know, from the early 1800s until the Civil War, through the 1850s, they kept growing, and they didn't survive the Civil War in the same robust form. But at their peak, they were shipping out from Pleasant Hill on the Kentucky River hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds of preserves. They really, in some ways, invented the packaged goods business in America with their seed packets and a sense of design and branding. And I think there's similarities until recently, and your monastery still produces some food products as well for the market.
Yeah, bourbon fruitcake and bourbon fudge.
Yes.
I don't know if Shakers would go for that.
And you work in the kitchen, but you don't work in fudge or fruitcake production.
There was some years I worked in the fudge, but
And
yeah.
tell us about the labora part of your work at Gethsemani.
Well, it's basically 4 hours of work a day, which is not an 8-hour job day like many people's jobs, because our emphasis is the contemplative life. There should be time for reading, for prayer, and other things, and it's enough to sustain us. We're able to live by the work of our own hands, and by the products we sell. So we're very fortunate that way. Not every monastery is able to succeed in that.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about, you learned to be a monk under probably the most famous monk of the 20th century, Thomas Merton, when you arrived in 1958. I know you recounted some of the disagreements you had along the way, or not disagreements, but it's got to be hard to learn to be a monk. Tell us just a little bit about what it was like to learn under Father Lewis.
Well,
Thomas
when I
Merton.
came to the monastery, I had forgotten that Father Lewis was the monastic name of Thomas Merton. I had already read The Seven-Story Mountain. So I was here for a month before I learned that my novice master was Thomas Merton. And that was good, because at that point I had related to him as my director and novice master rather than as a famous author. And he wasn't hiding it, but he kept it in the background. He pretty much blended in with the community. It's just like one of the other monks, and he was good at coming to choir and going to the manual labor. Since he had books to write and classes to prepare, he would only come to the novice work about once a week, maybe twice a week. He preferred mainly to pick up an axe and lead us off to the woods to trim the forest and cut down the fallen trees and for firewood, things like that. He really liked to do that, manual labor.
Again, the prayer and the labor, right?
But his talks were always very interesting, his conferences. Of course, and he was an excellent teacher. And then, of course, you would go see him once every other week. That was kind of for spiritual direction, one-on-one relationship. And, I'd ask how you doing and how are things in choir, and you might make complaints or, so it was very informal, but then he could bring some real insights to the situation. How's your relationship to your family, for instance? And we came back to that pretty often.
And I'm interested by the fact, Merton, of course, had one of the most ecumenical minds, open minds, passionate student of obviously Catholicism, but also, as we know, Buddhism, Hinduism, Sufism, every other faith tradition, right. Judaism. And then in this last decade of his life, he got interested in the Shakers. And it's interesting that Shakertown, or Pleasant Hill, was actually, you had to drive right through the town of Shakertown if you were driving from Gethsemani to Lexington. And it appears that just almost randomly that had never happened, or he'd never stopped to get out. And he became immediately enamored of the design sensibility, I would say first, and then started studying the tradition and the history of them. He ended up, for him, not writing a lot, but a couple of essays. One, an interesting kind of travelogue article for a magazine about Shakertown, and then one, an introduction to a book about Shaker furniture. Do you remember Merton's interest in the Shakers?
Yeah. Well, he mentioned it in a conference one day, but he had been to Lexington and stopped by on the way back and was very impressed with the architecture. The place was run down. They hadn't renovated it yet, but he said he knew of a group that was interested in doing that. So this was early on. I wasn't surprised to see that he ended up doing some writing on it.
one of my favorite quotes from him, and one that many have heard before, but he wrote about Shaker furniture. The peculiar grace of a Shaker chair is due to the fact that it was made by someone capable of believing that an angel might come and sit on it.
Yes. Perfect.
It's a pretty good sentence, right?
Yeah.
I don't know that you can top that as a description of at least a spiritual description of a Shaker chair. But he also wrote, I think he appealed to it, I think for the same reasons you talk about the Cistercian tradition, that it was a completely miraculous achievement of forms. I think it's a very interesting description of the physical forms relating to the theological or forms of belief. And somehow you can feel them so strongly connected.
Yes, well, that wasn't always consistent. I mean, one monastery differs from another, but on the whole, monasteries in the United States and Europe have that kind of grace. There were Baroque periods with Cistercians, especially Eastern Europe. It doesn't look a bit monastic. But when I came to Gethsemani, the place looked kind of dumpy, really. But thanks to people like Father Lewis and a few artists in the community, they realized that it really should be better and can be better. And they set about making it better. So the place is, quite lovely now.
So was that the work you described kind of in the 1960s, basically, of kind of enhancing the?
Oh, yes. That's when the big renovation took place. All four wings, including the church. The church was the last thing we did, but the other three wings, we did it pretty much ourselves. When knocking out taking the windows out, knocking the plaster off the wall to expose the bricks, tearing out the flooring, putting in new flooring, all that is work we did of ourselves with some little professional help now and then, like pouring the terrazzo floors. So we have marble floors now, terrazzo.
Lots of work. Have you spent time at either of Kentucky's Shaker communities?
I've visited there 3 or 4 times, I think, and I'm always, charmed by it. And I haven't been there recently, though. They're air conditioning the buildings. I don't think the Shakers would appreciate that.
No, but tourists do today. So
yes, well, we air condition our monastery.
Do you now?
At least the church, not the rest of it.
Yeah. You're not visiting anywhere but Gethsemani right now. So tell us a little about the state of Gethsemani in 2020.
Well, monks are supposed to practice the vow of stability. That is, you stay home. Stability is actually one of the three vows. And in that, you promise to remain in this community for the rest of your life. But that is also attached to the practice of enclosure, separation from the world. Separation from the world is another key factor connecting us with the Shakers or them with us. So you don't go out of the monastery unless there's, a definite reason for it, doctor's appointment or maybe some business that has to be done. But we have had visitors. The Rule of St. Benedict commends hospitality. People should be welcomed as Christ when they come. So we have a retreat house, which accommodates about 53 people, and a visitor center, with a bookstore and displays. Well, none of that is open now. We don't have any retreatants. We don't have anybody coming into church while we're in prayer. As a result, monastery probably is pretty much the way it was early on in the 1800s, when we didn't have retreatants and monks really had to stay home. It was not much of a choice in any case to get out. So I think most of the guys appreciate it.
How about you?
I'm enjoying it. I meet with a lot of groups that come. They want to hear a talk, or they might want to go see the Hermitage, Merton's Hermitage. And so I meet the most interesting people that way. But for the time being, I'm appreciative of what I've got.
So while monasticism is more monastic than ever for monks,
Yes.
the world is more monastic for the rest of us non-monks who are to a relative degree more isolated than we are in normal life. I find a few small similarities. I've been sitting at the same place to work every day. I've watched nature very differently. Life has its stresses and complications right now, but there are aspects of which I think kind of the spirit of observation is more present. We're much more, people aren't traveling. So I think the way monks really, and the Shakers, had a deep sense of place and were very grounded in their home place is much more intense for everyone in the world this year.
Well, everybody has to become a bit of a monk now.
Yes.
But so many people find they're just getting restless.
Yeah.
And there's nothing else to do. They'll go out in the streets and demonstrate. I wonder if there'd be so many crowds if people had jobs now. But
well, first, I just get advice for those of us who are feeling restless. You all have had better training than we have.
Oh, precisely. And Pascal says that one of the most difficult things for a man to do is to sit alone in his room. And that's what we have to learn how to do. And meditation is part of our practice.
You mentioned the protests, and I want to end by, obviously it's a year of the coronavirus and trying to keep ourselves and the people we care about in our communities healthy. It's also a year with obviously a much more heightened sense of something Merton was very aware of, is racial injustice and its history in America and how present it remains with us. Monks, like the Shakers, address these things in some ways in the way they lived, where they lived, but mostly through prayer. And so I want to end by asking a monk who's been observing the rule of St. Benedict now for over 60 years. How can you help us think about, we can go to protests, we can fight for change. How do we look for that inner change through contemplation that can help build a more equal world?
Yeah, well, before God, we're all naked. We're all very poor. We just simply have to be ourselves. And if you can accept yourself in that context, in your own poverty, you're going to be able to accept other people in their poverty. And ultimately, we're all equal. And the rule of St. Benedict does not give preference to the nobility. You rank in the community according to when you enter the monastery. So if a noble comes 1 hour after a peasant, the peasant ranks ahead of the noble. So there was that sense of equality. The other thing is everybody is given a voice. When an important question comes up, everybody should be allowed to express their opinion or express what they feel is the will of the Holy Spirit for the rest of the community.
Well, those are both themes we're all focused on. And then I think the other part that's monastic, so thank you, which is equal. We're all equal, or some come first, but it doesn't matter who, the first may be last, the last may be first. What about the sense, I think so many of us, many people are doing things, but I think there's a sense of frustration among many that monks learn about, that they can't actually make change faster. Again, any final lessons for kind of how you think about contemplation and its contributions to change?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's a lesson in detachment. You have to be able to live and work and hope without seeking the fruits of your prayer, without being attached to results. You simply do the good for the sake of the good. You do what is right for the sake of the right, whether it's acknowledged or helps anybody else. That's not the primary thing. So that's an interior thing. You have to start with your own attitude and your own detachment. And hopefully, it can bring about some improvement in life. It certainly brings about an improvement in your life.
Well, that note is both inspiring and almost a few points there sounded like words from a Shaker hymn. So I think it's an appropriate place for us to stop and me to say a very deep thank you to you, Brother Paul Quenon.
Happy to be here.
Great insights for our exhibit. I do hope that at some point while these exhibits are up, you may come visit the renovated Speed. I know you've been to the museum before, and we'd love to welcome you again.
Yeah, I'd love to.
All right. Thank you. And thank you for taking time out of your day.
My pleasure.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.